Hello, my name is Michael Lott-Manier, and today we're going to be talking about the Northern California wildfires of October 2017, also known as the North Bay Area or Wine Country fires. These were some of the deadliest and most destructive fires in California and U.S. history, and I think they teach us some really important and vital lessons about the role public health can and should be playing in preparing for and responding to emergencies like this in the context of climate change, population growth, geographic issues, and social and health inequities. In terms of the fires themselves, it's important to understand that this area is kind of a tinderbox for wildfires. You have these highly irrigated agricultural valleys surrounded by, because of that irrigation, very dry forests in the hills. So you combine that terrain with this interface with human activity. So you have power lines maintained by Pacific Gas and Electric rubbing against dry tree branches. You have sparks starting fires there. So naturally, you have these ignition points. Combine that with these dry, hot winds that were screaming down the valleys in October the 7th and 8th that had these little sparks of wildfires that then were pushed like by a bellows a dozen miles or more in the course of a couple of hours with the Tubbs fire. So it was a perfect firestorm here that took place. And so giving credit and context to the local emergency services who did find themselves overwhelmed, it was one of the most, if not the most severe fire event in recent memory for people in the area. The impact of these fires was tragic. There were 44 deaths between about October 7th and the 21st. The Tubbs fire alone was the second deadliest fire in California history, with I believe 22 people dying. So this was an extremely high mortality event. There were a high number of deaths for the duration and even the geographic scope of this fire, which were all big, but still the number of people who died as a result stands out as an indicator that the response did not go as well as it should have. And because this fire was not strictly a forest fire or even minimally in populated areas, the materials that were released by the flames into the atmosphere were extremely toxic. Thousands of homes, businesses, everything that was within those structures and other things, vehicles, gas stations, all of these things were affected by the fire, and the flames released extremely hazardous materials. So smoke inhalation and respiratory injuries were kind of the signature wounds of this fire, as they are often, but because it was a populated area, not just a forest fire, those were especially acute and complicated. There were about 245,000 acres burned, and there was an estimate of $14.5 billion in property loss damage within the area itself. And again, we're looking at wine country, this agricultural hub in Northern California. So they estimated an $85 billion hit to the overall U.S. economy. And looking at the participants that we want to evaluate, the federal government did activate FEMA and EPA resources that were key to some of the emergency response, but really on the later end. So I want to focus mainly on the state and county governments that were involved. So at the state level, the Office of Emergency Services, and particularly CAL FIRE, the State Firefighting Authority, I want to look at the role that they played. On the county level, Sonoma County Emergency Services, the Sheriff's Office, search and rescue workers, they're key people in all of this, and they did an after-action report that was kind of self-critical about their response, so I want to look at that. And then healthcare facilities, I want to call them out in particular because those are sort of the entities that were carrying out some of the public health training and preparedness planning when the fire broke out, and that during that time when 44 people died, the healthcare facilities performed relatively well compared to the rest of the emergency services array. And I want to call out it was largely because of the public health approach and the focus that was given by local health departments to what hospitals, clinics, and other facilities should do in the event of a wildfire. To briefly review the incident command system implementation in this situation, the CAL FIRE firefighting authorities established an incident command post in Santa Rosa, and then used the county government offices to set up an emergency operations center with the Sonoma County Emergency Services Office. And having established those sort of central hubs, the logistics and planning mobilization of people at the local level went through, of course, the local fire department, the search and rescue workers, and then the health facilities throughout the region. So hospitals, centers for people with disabilities, long-term care and skilled nursing facilities, all of those fell under the purview of the Sonoma County Health Services Department. And so their portion of the ICS in terms of reaching different segments of the population really focused on that healthcare intersection between public health and healthcare services. In assessing the performance of different entities during this emergency, I want to call out a report done by KQED, the local public health, public radio station in the San Francisco North Bay area that did an evaluation or investigation into how the emergency services offices involved in the response did and did not coordinate and communicate with each other to get people the notification to evacuate. So the bottom line, in a lot of ways, as I've tried to illustrate with this diagram, is that people were supposed to receive reverse 911 calls or other electronic notifications relatively quickly, letting them know to evacuate. There were mandatory evacuations for people throughout Sonoma County, surrounding areas. So the fact that people responsible for sending out those messages did not get early notification, that the people that were supposed to be telling them did not know who was responsible for initiating those orders, was something that in the Sonoma County After Action Report they also called out, was the who's on first problem during an emergency. Who was responsible for saying we need to let everybody know about their evacuation orders, who's verifying that that's been happening, and who is following up to make sure people have actually evacuated, excuse me. So we're looking at this communication breakdown that because of these very rapid sequence of events, where the time period between local fire departments knowing there was a high fire danger to emergency services being overwhelmed was really less than 12 hours. So the fact that the rapidness of communication, the clarity of who was supposed to be doing what was all breaking down during this time period is a real area of concern. And looking at those 44 deaths during the overall emergency, a lot of them, I believe, can be attributed to these breakdowns. Compared to that emergency services breakdown in communications, public health really had a very strong response during this disaster. The highlight of it was the fact that 2 hospitals had to be evacuated in the middle of the wildfire, Sutter Health and Kaiser Permanente in Santa Rosa, and over 1,160 people were safely evacuated from these hospitals, clinics, centers for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and older adults. So the fact that that happened successfully is attributable to a number of factors. One was that local health facilities, thanks to the oversight of health departments at the state and local level, had resource mapping software to know, okay, here's where people who need to be evacuated are located. Here's alternate locations for them to receive life-sustaining services once they have been evacuated. So the knowledge of who, what, and where and during this emergency was facilitated by that resource mapping software, which was a part of the public health infrastructure supported by a public health emergency preparedness cooperative agreement between the local health department and the CDC. So there was that evacuation emergency response was, again, a success story in this overall situation. The smoke inhalation and respiratory issues experienced by people, that is of course very dangerous for folks with cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. It can trigger heart attacks and stroke. So oxygen supplies, AEDs, personal protective equipment, those were all distributed very effectively by public health to the different agencies that were conduits for them to the public. And then an overall focus again on that life support dimension was assuring the safety of vulnerable populations, which is a sort of a defined public health role. So for people who needed intensive care, who had chronic illnesses, who had acute pharmacy needs, including folks that had treatment and recovery and behavioral health and needed access to medication-assisted treatment therapies. There were continuity plans in place because of public health oversight. There were centers for people with disabilities, sort of regulated by the public health and Medicaid nexus there in California. And then there was, in the long term, there was hazardous materials management that was an important role that public health played, again, more distal from the actual fire itself, but still in terms of responding to it was important in protecting people's health and saving lives in the long term. In terms of the lessons that public health has to teach the emergency preparedness and response world overall, I know it's something that's been well integrated for many years, but in the context of this particular situation with the failure to notify people to evacuate, to residents to evacuate compared to the successful evacuation of hospitals, I want to call out the fact that with the public health approach is this focus on life support and continuity of services. So if you're taking someone who needs to have an ICU level of care from one hospital to a sort of emergency holding area during an evacuation, you need to know, okay, how am I making sure their air supply, their medicine, their medical equipment, all of that is being moved safely. So that life support focus, I think, is something that can be adopted from the healthcare facilities management sector of public health into the overall emergency services model. Obviously, if people are not communicating with each other and knowledgeable about and confident about which roles they're supposed to be playing, then that transport of medically fragile folks is not going to take place. So that is an important component and a lesson to share. I think the multidisciplinary staff of public health and healthcare agencies and the diverse trainings they engage in is a really valuable thing in making healthcare facilities and response systems resilient. And I also want to just acknowledge, especially because it's my bias in this whole situation, the fact that mental and behavioral health expertise is present in the public health world. People that know how to communicate with others during a crisis, assist people during an emergency, maintain that calm focus on getting people the help they need, and also looking at how to encourage people to take part in actions. So when you're trying to motivate someone who may be reluctant to leave their home to evacuate, or getting people engaged in services, that's where that mental and behavioral health expertise really can play an extra added role to benefit populations during an emergency. To their credit, Sonoma County did an after-action report in the response to the wildfires that found they needed to update and expand their alert system. And I found this phrase in their after-action report that I really wanted to call out: develop a 24/7 life safety standard operational capabilities. So that, to me, sounds like what hospitals have to do. You have to have 24/7 life safety standard operational capabilities. And licensing and monitoring the safety of hospitals is a public health role. So again, I think there are many valuable lessons from public health that can be applied to emergency response as a case study. To summarize, and in the interest of keeping this presentation under 15 minutes, I'm just going to mention some things to draw it together, stuff I've already mentioned, and put it in a slightly different context. So these were known as the wine country fires. We're talking about an area not far from Silicon Valley, relatively high income, more white, fewer communities of color area in this North Bay of San Francisco area. Compare that to the so-called Oakland firestorm of 30 years ago, where the health and economic and social consequences of that wildfire were felt so keenly by communities of color who were low income for years after the fire, and we're already seeing a much greater level of resilience in Santa Rosa, for example, than Oakland. So calling that out and recognizing that background levels of health equity or inequity are key to preparedness and resilience. The more we promote health equity, the more prepared and resilient communities will be. Also, I don't think as a society, as emergency responders, we've really incorporated how people use cell phones to connect with each other, warn each other of dangers, make sure everyone's okay, check on status, that kind of stuff. I think leveraging that technology and connectivity ability that people have nowadays is something we have to culturally and operationally integrate better. And finally, California burns every year. The climate change trends that we see mean those fires are only going to become more frequent and more intense. So adapting to the tempo of California fires, learning what that means in terms of seasonal changes that different localities or regions should implement, we should incorporate the reality of climate change and the tempo of different threats into our preparedness plans. Thank you.